Hey historians, this is Miss V. Welcome back. We are in a new quarter and a new unit, and this is interwar period. This is quarter 4, unit 1, and this is lesson 3.1. So this is your guided notes for lesson 3.1. You'll find this in Canvas. So let's go ahead. This is instability after World War I. So let's get started. Alright, so this is your standard here to describe the causes and effects of the global depression that happened, especially those that happened and how in the United States and how it spread and how governments responded to this Great Depression that happened, especially in places like Germany, France, the United States, and Great Britain. Okay, these are your vocabulary words: depression, recession, collective bargaining, and deficit spending. So please make sure that you have the vocabulary words in there. All right, here we go. So your first answer, most Americans wanted to avoid this war. They did not want to be involved with European affairs, even though there was a big push to be, that nationalism and that pride of the United States, right? And being in the war. Most Americans did not want to be involved in European affairs. However, even though President Wilson adopted the League of Nations, the United States Senate refused to ratify or approve the Treaty of Versailles. And that meant, because they did not approve or ratify the Treaty of Versailles, that means that they could not join the League of Nations. So because of that, President Wilson saw that there's going to be some sort of conflict, ongoing conflict happening in Europe, and he was uneasy with what was going to happen in Europe. He wasn't sure that there was going to be peace and, security and so forth that was happening. And without the United States being a part of the League of Nations, then it wasn't as effective as it should be. Okay. So that's number 1 and 2. Here's 3, 4, and 5. Okay. Most nations that were involved in World War I, most of them, especially in Europe, they left unhappy because they felt that they did not get the things that they wanted in the peace settlement with the Treaty of Versailles, right? The French government had a very strong demand for security, and they demanded strict enforcement of the Treaty of Versailles, right? And in the Treaty of Versailles demanded that Germany was at fault and Hungary was at fault, but now it's called Austria. And Germans were required to pay reparations, right? Which was payments for damages that they done in World War I. Right? Germany did make its first initial payments, but they were hit with a financial crisis and they couldn't keep up with the reparation payments. So a lot of people were suffering, as you see here in this political cartoon, $55 billion. That's a lot for that time period. So that's how much Germany was saddled. As you see here, this is Germany. They were saddled with reparations, and it was literally burying their economy, right? So that's 3, 4, and 5. France, the issue of reparations that Germany had to pay, and of course they faced this crisis and not being able to pay those reparation payments. With that also, because of those reparation payments that they had to pay, and also they were in economic problems, a lot of German workers went on strike, right? So the German government, which was called the Wema Republic, okay, the Wema Republic decided, okay, well, we can't pay our workers, you can't get them to, we can't pay these reparations. Well, might as well we go ahead and print more money so that we can pay everybody. There's a problem with that, okay? You just can't go ahead and print money just because you need more money. Because if there's nothing backing it up that provides the worth of it, then it's just paper, right, that you're just printing. And that's pretty much what happened. Because they paid salaries just by printing more paper, that added to inflation, which is a rise in the prices of goods, right? So by the end of the war, the German mark, which is like the German dollar, quote unquote, right, became worthless, literally worthless, as you see here, right? By the end of 1923, the mark, the German mark, reached the level of 4.2 trillion marks to $1. So as you see here, this lady, it literally made a paper dress out of her German money because it was that worthless. And children are stacking them up like toys because it was so worthless, right? And that is called hyperinflation, okay? And that's pretty much what happened. They got so heavily involved with printing more money that they caused the prices of things to go up so much that the value of their money was worthless, and that's hyperinflation. Okay. So the Dawes Plan, which was named after an American banker that was the commissioner or chaired the commission for that plan, they came up with this plan, and this is your number 8, to help stabilize the German economy, but also it helped to reduce the reparation payments that Germany had to pay. In giving also the United States, if you see here in this chart, the Allies would all pay, they all got their reparations payments, right? The United States would put in loans to Germany. So they're loaning Germany money. Germany then pays those reparation payments to the Allies. And then the Allies then pay the United States and their war debt payments, right? So now there's this cycle of a financial system so that Germany is not saddled with debt from the reparations payments, and it also helped to stabilize their economy, right? So there was a brief period of prosperity in Europe because of this Dawes Plan that occurred. It was short-lived, okay? So even though there was prosperity that was happening in Europe for a short period of time, but in the United States there was a lot of prosperity because America, or the United States rather, was investing heavily into Europe. It was short-lived, and you'll see why in a minute, okay? Also, this is number 9. Also, with the prosperity, the short period of prosperity, came a short period of diplomacy. So if you remember, during World War I, France was fighting with Germany over a portion of territory that Germany took from the Franco-Russian War, right? Okay. So they of course were very stern with trying to get their reparations, and when they did not get their reparations, France decided to mobilize into a certain part called the Ruhr Valley, right? So in that valley, now there's tension because Germany does not want to necessarily get into an armistice or a battle with France again. With war, they just came out of war. They don't have the money, they don't have the resources. So in order to develop some form of diplomacy, this Treaty of Locarno was developed, right? And that guaranteed a new border along that same area, that same valley, with France and Belgium and Germany. So now they're kind of cooperating in terms of that border, that western border on France that Germany once had, but now they lost, but they took it before anyway. A lot of back and forth, but that's pretty much what it was. So people in Europe, as you see here in this political cartoon, this young lady represents Europe, and this is the Treaty of Locarno, and this was the Dawes Plan. They saw that as a step towards disarmament and moving towards peace and not war and tension and so forth. So they thought that, okay, well, things are settling down now. We're coming to prosperity. We're coming to a peaceful transition from the war. You know, things are looking up, right? So they said. Because there's things that happen after, right? Again, here in this one, number 10, the Kellogg-Briand Pact. This was a pact that also tried to foster some form of diplomacy, and 65 nations, which include a lot of the European nations, also signed this accord and pledged to renounce war as a national policy. That means that they would not resort to war just to justify their governmental or national issues, right? That was signed, but nothing was said in terms of anyone that would violate this pact, right? So, you know, they thought that they were dismissing the spoils or the issue or tensions of war, but they never mentioned if somebody broke that promise or that pledge, what would happen. And of course, we all know that we got into World War II, so obviously that pledge was broken a long time ago, right? So we have to find out why later that happened, but you will. All right. So this is number 11 and 12. So remember I said all of that peace and prosperity that was happening and all of the diplomacy and so forth. People thought things are looking up. Well, that kind of collapsed. Not kind of, it did, in a bad way. In the United States, there was a huge economic collapse, right? And it became known as the Great Depression. But it started, the collapse kind of started, not kind of, but it did start in the United States with the stock market crash of 1929. And 4 factors played this major role as the start of depression. So that's your answer for number 11, as you see here. There was a series of downturns in the individual nations itself in terms of their economy. So that played a factor in the Great Depression, this global depression. That second trigger was, of course, the U.S. stock market crash in the United States in 1929. And because of that, that spread throughout Europe and the world. Because when many people invested their stocks and they were selling them for more than they were worth, they got in this panic mode and they had to sell their stock really fast, right? But they were selling them for less than what they actually paid for. So that made the stock worthless, right? So many of the investors, companies that were investing in places like Germany and France and so forth, they had to pull their money out because they were losing money fast, right? So now goes Germany's investments for them to pay their reparations, right? Now goes France's money where they were getting money from Germany. So a lot of issues occurred, and that's contributed a lot to the Great Depression. Also, there was an uneven distribution of wealth. As we know, there were people that were very, 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 very rich, right? If we talk about the United States, we're talking about the Rockefellers, Carnegies, Firestones, J.P. Morgan, those very, very rich conglomerates or oligarchs, right? Or families that had a lot of wealth, right? And where you have very poor families working on the farms and so forth. And then also the last one, as you see here, there was a surplus of agricultural products. So that means that farmers had a lot of crops, right? So they were overabundance in wheat. There was an overabundance in corn, right? Things of that nature. And they couldn't sell them to other markets in Europe or in Africa and so forth because they had enough too. They don't need them. So what do you do with a bunch of corn and wheat that nobody needs, right? It just goes to waste. So that's pretty much what happened. And the farming industry suffered greatly for it. And a lot of people worked on the farms, so they were unemployed. And that's what caused the Great Depression globally, okay? And as you see here, number 12, this is what caused the stock market to crash. People sold their stocks for more than what they were worth. Okay, so this is number 13. The Great Depression wasn't new. Economic depression wasn't new in Europe, but it really hit hard, especially in Germany, right? As you see here, 1 in every 4 employed. 5.5 million Germans, or 30% of the German labor force, was unemployed. And they were homeless and they filled the streets. About 12 million United States citizens were out of work and unemployed in the workforce. Okay, so as you see, United States and Germany was hit very hard with the depression. Okay, as you see the U.S. unemployment rate here during that time, it was quite high. All right, so this is 14. Whoops, there we go. This is 14. So like I said, in Germany, the Weimar Republic was the government, provisional government that was running Germany, right? And they had no idea how to handle the depression and how to handle the economic problems. So they experienced runaway inflation or hyperinflation, right? And because of that hyperinflation that they experienced, that came with a lot of social problems and political problems, right? A lot of families saw that their money and their life savings just disappear, almost like it was overnight. But over time, their savings just disappeared and they were left homeless. They were left unemployed, right? As you see here, by 1930, 3 million people. By March, 4.38 million by December. Right, so unemployment grew, and because of the unemployment and losing practically all of your life savings, people were afraid and fearful that that's what their life was going to be. Right, they don't have food to give to their kids, they don't have a roof to put over their head, they're wondering what's going to happen, is this going to be their life? So they're in dire fear, and because of that, they're going to listen to anyone that is going to promise them a better life, the life that they were used to in the 20s, in the early 20s, in the late 1919s, and so forth. So anyone that could give them that hope of returning back to that life, they're going to listen to them, and that gave rise a way to the rise of extremist parties, particularly one, Adolf Hitler. Okay. All right. In France also faced economic issues because of the depression. Not so much because their economy was a bit more balanced. What they did face was a lot of political chaos. Okay. And because of that political chaos, there was a new political party that was formed, and it was a group of communists, a group of socialists and radicals, and they became known as the Popular Front government. And that Popular Front government, they created a program to try to combat against the depression, and it was called the French New Deal. It was patterned off of the New Deal like the United States. And in the French New Deal, that it was something that was beneficial for workers. So they gave workers the right to collective bargaining. So that means as a union, they can bargain for better wages, right? And a 40-hour work week. So they're now, instead of working, long hours, they're working 40 hours a week, and in an industry. And also they have a standard minimum wage. So again, they can't, now that with that French New Deal, workers in France are getting a certain wage they can't go below that wage, right? It's a standard minimum wage. So they're hoping that with those changes that it would fuel a movement from the depression, all right? And that was in France. In Great Britain, they too experienced limited prosperity, but they were also affected by the Great Depression. As as you see here, they had unemployment as well. But conservatives, they thought that traditional ways of combating the depression was to balance, use balanced budgets and have certain tariffs. Tariffs are taxes against, are tariffs on imported goods and sometimes exported goods. So they wanted to put protective tariffs on imported goods coming in so that they can make more money, right, from European nations. However, this person here, John Maynard Keyes, he believed that the government should increase demand for products by creating jobs through deficit spending. And that means that he felt that the government should create jobs and go into debt to create jobs because it's necessary for the economy. Much of his ideas was not accepted by this conservative group, and they felt that the depression would just kind of wane out itself without any government assistance. However, a lot of European nations were being influenced by socialist practices. So there was this I would say not even a battle but contention between whether the government should be involved in helping people get out of this depression or whether they should be hands off and let it ride out itself. Okay, in this case, Great Britain, they were kind of back and forth with that. Because the government was run by conservatives, they went about the traditional way, kind of having a hands-off approach. Okay. All right, so this is number 18 and 19. In the United States, as I mentioned, the United States was hit really, really hard by the Depression, right? And greatly affected by it, except, with the exception of Germany. As you see here, industrial production fell almost 50%, right? And more than 12 million people were unemployed, and banks were closed, businesses failed, etc. That's your number 18. However, Herbert Hoover, Herbert Hoover was the president during the start of the Great Depression, right? And he had this hands-off approach. He was like, well, we're not going to do much of anything. We're not going to implement any programs. The depression is going to kind of ride out itself. We'll see how it goes kind of approach. Americans hated that. They did not like that at all because nothing was changing, right? So once his time was up, he was out. And this president here, Franklin D. Roosevelt, was in. And Franklin D. Roosevelt was elected president by a landslide, and he adopted a policy of active government intervention. So he was a Democrat, and this is how a lot of the political party system shifted, because most people were once Republican, but because Franklin D. Roosevelt was Democrat, the outlook of political parties shifted, where people voted more Democrat than Republican at this point. So he adopted this government program where the government is directly involved with trying to help heal the economy in the United States, and that was called the New Deal. Okay, and that's your number 19. So in the New Deal was basically programs by the government that increased public works. So they hired workers to build things like bridges and roads and post offices and airports and things like that. If you listen to the news quite often, the BBB, the Build Better plan from Biden is quite similar to this, okay? Where, hiring workers to fix things like bridges and roads and build airports and so forth. It's pretty similar idea. And the whole thing is to try to increase the economy and boost the economy so that they can get out of depression. Same issue here. During COVID, we ended up in a recession because of all of the issues with COVID. So as a president, the idea here is to boost the economy, right? So it was the same idea here with the New Deal. Also, the Roosevelt administration issued social legislation or socialist ideals or legislation that began the U.S. welfare system. The U.S. welfare system is a part of our system today where you have the Social Security Act that gives old age pensions that is collected at the age of 65 when you are no longer working. So that is kind of a safety net guarantee that when you stop working or you retire, that you get a certain payment each month from the government to make sure that you can survive and live. Okay. The reforms prevented like a social upheaval, a social revolution by from the United States, from Americans, because Americans were ticked off that they lost their life savings and their employment and so forth. But even though these social programs were put in place, like the WPA and so forth, and the alphabet agencies that were put in place, it did not solve the unemployment problems. Okay, so that's the second part of number 20. What did solve the unemployment problems would come later, as you see here in the 1930s, the late 1930s, when World War I broke out and the United States became involved, and they had to hire workers in the weapons industries, and that brought U.S. workers back into full employment. Okay, so that's number 21. And that is the end of the guided notes section. You do have a lesson activity, and we'll be going over this in class. With this part, you're gonna tell me when we're in class. You're gonna tell me if my answers are correct, and if it's not correct, you have to correct them. Okay, so I'll go over this in class, and I'll see you in the next video. Peace.